Get in, loser, we're going to space. This worked better in my head. Hi, I'm Lee. I'm a cosplayer. Most of the time I make cosplays based on references, but sometimes I also like to design my own outfits for characters I love. And I really wanted to make a space retro outfit. What character would be better for that than the space queen herself, Rosalina? So before starting this cosplay, I had a rough idea in mind what design I wanted to create. I was browsing a lot of Pinterest for that, but the biggest inspiration here was the Space Groove Lux skin. I might even do a cosplay one day. Have fun with this making of video and let's go to space.
Before I started sewing, I made this absolutely beautiful sketch. It did turn out a bit different in the end, but it was a good start. Most of the time I make the patterns myself, and what I always love to do is grab some of my fitting clothes and costumes and trace around them. To get a pattern for the body, I was using my Supergirl costume for the upper part and a swimsuit for the lower part. I usually still have to do some minor adjustments, but it's a great method to get a pattern on the fly. I then placed the pattern on a blue sparkly fabric and cut out one piece for the front and the back. This fabric really was a pretty find and I am absolutely in love with it. Sometimes shiny fabric can look a bit cheap, but this is made of a lot of shiny little dots which make it look super high quality. I totally forgot that I would need to split up the back in two parts to sew in the zipper, but luckily I could still cut it in half because I had enough sewing allowance on the sides left. I sewed in the zipper, but it sadly turned out super wobbly because stretchy fabric tend to lose shape and make the zipper look blah. So I'm redoing that step later and show you a little trick how to fix that. I do have to walk like this because I have needles in my crotch, but it fits. Alright, back again. Once I sewed the front and back together, I marked the place where I wanted to add the diamond-shaped detail in the front. I measured everything again to make sure to find the exact center, drew the shape and cut it out. And boy was I scared to ruin the suit in that step. I then used that cutout as a pattern for the counterpart and added sewing allowance. That piece is also made out of stretchy fabric I had left from my Woman cosplay. I pinned and sewed the cutout back onto the suit and it turned out fine. But the shape was a bit too pointy for my taste, so I decided to frame it with a silver buyer's tape. I made that myself using silver leftover fabric and I pinned a needle through my ironing board, pulled the fabric through and ironed it. There's an extra tool for just that step, but if you don't have that, this method works just fine. I placed and sewed it along the seam and ended up liking this way more since it also adds more to the design itself. Random question, if you want to check if the pen is still writing, do you grab a paper or do you use your hand? There's only two types of people in this world. Then it was time for my beloved space sausages. I made two little space sausages going along each side of my hips. The base is made out of plastic left over from my Woman wings. I first measured the rough length and cut out, I don't know how to describe the shape, but it looks a bit like a rundown croissant. I think you get cleaner results if you make them out of EVA foam and shape them to your liking, but I wanted to use mostly leftover material for this cosplay and it worked just fine. I covered the little sausages with silver fabric and sewed it on by hand. I tried using the machine, but I needed the seams to be really tight. By the way, space sausages is not easy to pronounce, so please say it with me 10 times. Space sausages, space sausages, space sausages, space sausages. I then sewed two space sausages together, put on the suit and pinned it on, carefully trying not to prick my crotch again. I also sewed these on by hand and absolutely hated it. This was by far the worst part, but at least it took the longest. For the sleeves, I just roughly measured the sleeves of my Supergirl costume, marked those points directly onto the fabric and cut them out. I used to really hate sewing sleeves, but by now find them rather easy to make, especially if it's very forgiving stretch fabric, where you can sew like that and nobody cares. I sewed them onto the body and also added a white color. For that, I just folded the white stretchy fabric in half, cut out a long rectangle and sewed it on. Let's get back to the zipper. To prevent the fabric from losing shape, I glued in a long small strip of non-stretchy fabric. You would normally add some interfacing, but I didn't have any left and my neat little trick worked totally fine. Then you can just easily sew along. Yeah, easily. Sewing zippers is always a pain, but adding extra fabric makes you hate everything a little bit less. I didn't plan to also use the shiny blue fabric for the boot covers because this fabric was quite expensive, but I had surprisingly a lot left and decided to use that. That piece was just enough fabric to comfortably cut out 3 boot parts, but of course I needed 4. But if there's one thing you need to know about me, it's that I never give up and never surrender. So with the power of manifesting and puzzling, I managed to squeeze the last inch out of this fabric. Here you can see my brain at work really trying to make this happen.
round of applause.
I first sewed the puzzle pieces together and then sewed each of the 2 pieces with a zigzag stitch to keep the seams flexible. I also added a bit of that white stretchy fabric as a border to make it look a bit more interesting. To prevent the boots from falling down, I first sewed pants made out of stretchy mesh fabric close to my skin tone using old leggings as a pattern. I sewed the pieces together and it turned out a bit too small, but it's fine as long as I don't move too much. I put on the mesh fabric pants and pinned on the boot covers. I then sewed along with the zigzag stitch, and to add some more details, I added my silver bias tape as a border. That one isn't stretchy, so I had to make sure to keep the fabric tense while I'm adding the bias tape. I also did not completely close the seam at the back to have a bit of more wiggle room. The gloves were comparatively easy to make. I placed my hand on a piece of paper and traced around my hand and fingers. I folded the white stretchy fabric in half, drew along the pattern and simply sewed along the lines. The fabric was a bit wobbly and slipped down my arm like a greasy space slug, so I reinforced them. Normally I would add a bit of interfacing, but by now you noticed I had none left, so I sewed in another layer of white cotton fabric. I covered the ends with silver bias tape and ta-da! Done! The tiara and the star on my chest are both made out of foam that I covered with silver fabric. One thing that I never did was casting gemstones, so I had nothing left to do that. But I had some gemstones left that I originally bought from my Angewoman glove. I gently scraped off the silver foil with a box cutter and glued the stones to shiny blue, red and gold fabric. It's not as shiny as raisins. Okay, it's not as shiny as resin, but given the fact that I wasn't sure what I was doing and came up with that idea last minute, it turned out quite good. And now, to the piece that I'm most proud of. My trash ray gun. Since I mostly wanted to use materials I already had at home, I let out my inner trash panda and went through garbage. For once, it paid off that we didn't bring out the trash in quite a while. The corpus of the gun is a plastic bottle. It was a bit too long for my taste, so I cut off the end. I also didn't like the front part and cut it off with a bread knife. Probably not the tool you should use for that. But hey, I taped it back together and also inserted the upper part from an old spray bottle as a trigger. I glued in the lid to close the opening and used the lid of a bottle of old contact lenses solution as the muzzle. I also drilled in a little hole so I could insert a piece of pipe from the spray bottle. I covered the open end of the spray bottle with some foam and ended up with this beautiful trash ray gun. To paint it, I first covered everything in black acrylics as a base, and I had to redo it a few times because the paint wouldn't really stick to the plastic. I then painted it with white acrylics and added some blue and black details. I did most of this off camera because I didn't really know where I would want to go with the design and repainted it a lot before I ended up with this.
Ungewohnt dynamisch.
How do you like it?
It's good. Especially love the sock on your left foot.
Get in, loser. We're going to space.
To prevent the boots from falling down, I first sewed pants made out of stretchy fabric, mesh fabric, There's an actual tool for just that step, but if you don't have that, this method works just fine. And it's cheap. Like me. I'll cut that out.